You don't exist in our system, sir. Now please step aside. We have others waiting. The words landed like a slap, but the old Marine didn't flinch. Frank Delaney, 84, simply gathered his weathered folder, each page a memory soaked in sacrifice, and walked out without saying a word. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He just nodded once and disappeared into the falling snow. 11 minutes later, in a high-security room 2,000 miles away, a secure phone rang. The caller ID, White House, urgent. A man in uniform answered, "Yes, sir, we found him, and we were too late." The wind had teeth that morning. At 84 years old, Frank Delaney had known colder days. Korea, 51, in a foxhole without boots. But there was something lonelier about this kind of cold. It wasn't just in the air. It was in the way the world moved around him without seeing him. Frank pulled into the VA parking lot just after 8 a.m., his old Ford pickup coughing to a stop. Snow clung to the edges of the windshield like it was trying to hold on, just like he had, for decades. His fingers, knotted with arthritis, gripped a worn manila folder as he shut the door with effort. That folder held his entire military record, at least what was left of it after the fire at the St. Louis archives. The rest he had reconstructed himself. Letters, photographs, statements from fellow Marines who remembered the day he dragged 3 wounded men out of a burning bunker in Da Nang. Yellowed paper, creased edges, smudged ink. His proof. The VA office building loomed ahead, generic and gray. He straightened his back, out of habit, not pride, and walked toward the entrance, favoring his right leg with every step, the same leg that took shrapnel in '68 and never fully forgave him. Inside, the warmth hit him, but the welcome did not. A young security guard barely glanced at him. "ID," the man barked. Frank calmly offered his veteran card and driver's license, both trembling slightly in his weathered hand. The guard frowned at the small Swiss Army knife on his keyring. "You can't bring that in. It's just a tool. Been carrying it since my grandson gave it to me. Doesn't matter. Leave it or go back to your car." Frank hesitated, then placed the knife gently into the plastic bin. "I'll pick it up on my way out." "If someone's still here," the guard muttered without looking up. The waiting room was full. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The chairs were plastic, the air stale. He sat silently in the corner, hands folded over his folder like it was sacred. Around him, younger men scrolled through phones, laughed, dozed. One woman argued on the phone about her claim. Frank simply waited. After almost 2 hours, a bored voice called out, "Franklin Delaney, window 4. He stood, nodded, and walked with dignity to the counter. Behind it, a woman in heavy makeup and long acrylic nails barely looked up. "Claim number, VSR 882-1953, he replied softly. She tapped the keyboard. "Claim was denied. Notification sent 3 weeks ago." "I never got any notice. That's why I'm here. I brought everything again. All the paperwork." He carefully placed the folder on the counter. She sighed loudly and cracked the seal on the envelope. The contents spilled out. Old photos, carbon copy forms, hand-signed letters from now-dead officers. "These," she said loudly, holding up a document. "These are practically from the Stone Age." Some kids in the waiting room snickered. "We need digitized records. These don't even have scannable codes. Honestly, these could be anyone's." Frank said nothing. He simply nodded, began to carefully gather the papers she had scattered. A teenage boy across the room held up his phone, recording. The clerk didn't notice, or didn't care. "No verified time in the system. I don't make the rules." Frank placed the last sheet into the folder, tucked it under his arm. "Thank you for your time," he said quietly. He turned and walked out. No one held the door. No one looked up. No one thanked him. Frank Delaney was born in 1939 in a clapboard farmhouse in rural Kentucky, the third of 5 boys. His father was a World War I veteran who worked sunup to sundown in the coalfields, and his mother, quiet, devout, kept the house together with little more than flour, lye soap, and grace. At 17, Frank lied about his age and joined the Marines. It wasn't for glory. It was for something more basic, direction. "Boy needs to find his spine," his father had said as he signed the forged permission form with a quiet nod. Boot camp hit Frank like a train. He wasn't the biggest or the fastest, but he had something the drill instructors couldn't measure on paper. He never quit. Not once. When others collapsed in the sand or cursed under their breath, Frank clenched his jaw and pushed through. His file, what remains of it, shows 2 tours in Vietnam from 1966 to 1970. What it doesn't show is what the men who served beside him still remember like it was yesterday. At Da Nang, during a 72-hour siege, Frank led his unit through mortar fire after their commander was killed. He didn't flinch when the radio was knocked out. He used a mirror to signal their position, then crawled across enemy terrain to guide a medevac chopper to a group of wounded Marines, dragging 2 of them himself with a dislocated shoulder and shrapnel in his leg. He was the kind of guy who made you feel safer just because he was in the room, one former squad mate wrote in a letter years later. He didn't talk big, he just did the work. Frank earned 3 commendations during those years, but the Silver Star recommendation? Lost in the fog of paperwork, in a war many tried to forget. And when the fire tore through the National Personnel Records Center in 1973, his digital trail vanished with it. But Frank, he kept going. After the war, he didn't retreat into bitterness. He went home, back to the land, back to the quiet. He inherited his family's small farm, 30 acres of stubborn soil and aging equipment, and made it work. When neighbors couldn't afford a new carburetor or busted fan belt, Frank fixed it. If a single mother's furnace died in January, he'd be there with tools and duct tape. Never asked for a dime. Every Sunday without fail, he drove the church van to pick up the shut-ins and widows. No one asked him to. He just saw the need and showed up. He was the guy who never missed a funeral, as one pastor put it. Didn't matter if he knew the person well or not. He believed someone should be there to stand and honor a life. At the town's tiny high school, he became a mentor to boys who didn't have fathers. He taught them how to change oil, how to respect a rifle, how to shake hands without crushing bones. He never lectured, he showed. Frank never married. Too many ghosts, he once told a friend with a faint smile. But that didn't mean he was alone. The whole town in quiet ways had become his family. He never asked for help, not when the arthritis got bad, not when the roof started leaking, not even when the doctor told him his medication would cost more than he made in a month. Only then did he dig out that manila folder and try to apply for the benefits he had earned half a century earlier. He didn't want praise. He just wanted to buy medicine without selling off the last 2 acres of his family's land. And so he drove to that office, in the snow, with a limp, carrying the weight of memories no computer would recognize. The world saw an old man fumbling with outdated records. What it didn't see, at least not yet, was a man who once carried his country on his back and never let it fall. Frank Delaney had long since stopped expecting the world to notice him. That morning at the VA office was no different. No one helped him with the door. No one looked twice at the old man in the faded jacket, shuffling forward with a limp and a folder that looked like it belonged in a museum archive. But someone was watching. Sitting in the corner, slouched halfway down his chair, was a teenager named Jordan Meyer. 17, earbuds in, hoodie up, phone always ready. He wasn't there for his own claim. His mom had dragged him along. He barely looked up from his screen until he heard the clerk raise her voice. The words were sharp, dismissive. The kind people didn't usually say unless they forgot the person in front of them was still a human being. "These could be anyone's," the clerk scoffed, holding up Frank's yellowed papers like they were trash. That's when Jordan hit record. At first he thought he was capturing a funny boomers versus tech moment. Maybe he'd posted on TikTok under the caption, "When Grandpa brings a fax machine to a Wi-Fi fight." But as the seconds passed, something changed. Frank wasn't yelling. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't even defending himself. He was just gathering his papers, carefully, respectfully, like someone folding a flag. There was something in the way he moved, with steadiness, with quiet grace, that stopped Jordan cold. It reminded him of his grandfather, who'd passed last year, the one who used to sit silently at the back of every family barbecue, always polite, always watching, rarely speaking. The one no one had really known until the funeral, when the medals came out of the closet and the stories finally spilled. Now here was another man, almost invisible in the same way. Jordan kept the camera steady. Frank tucked the last document into his folder, nodded to the clerk with a faint "thank you," and turned to leave. No one else moved. No one clapped. No one followed. The door closed behind him with a soft chime. Later that night, Jordan sat in his room, rewatching the clip. It wasn't long, maybe 40 seconds, but it felt heavy, like it said something deeper than just "old man denied benefits." It said, "We forgot someone," and he didn't even complain. He added a caption, "84-year-old Marine denied his claim. This is how we treat them now?" He didn't expect it to go anywhere. But by morning it had 2 million views. By noon it had 10. The comments came in waves. "I'm sick to my stomach watching this. My dad served in Vietnam. He never talked about it. This, this hurts. Someone find out who this man is. He deserves better." News outlets picked it up. Hashtags formed. Chuck's Justice for Frank. Chun Honor, the Forgotten. Veteran, not processed. It crossed political lines. People from every walk of life, liberal, conservative, veteran, civilian, found common ground in one universal truth. We had failed someone who gave everything. At 1:07 p.m. that afternoon, the clip reached a man sitting in a secure conference room at the Pentagon, Lieutenant General Daniel Renier, National Security Deputy, 3-star general, West Point graduate. The moment he saw Frank's face, he dropped his stylus. It was him, Uncle Frank, his mother's quiet brother who sent hand-carved wooden toys every Christmas and never attended a single family dinner. He had no idea Uncle Frank had even served, let alone what he had done. Renier stood abruptly, excused himself from the meeting, and stepped into the hallway. His hands were already dialing before the door even closed. The voice on the other end answered, "White House Senior Policy Office. This is Handler." Renier didn't hesitate. "This is General Renier. I need an executive review opened right now on a Sergeant Frank Delaney. Retroactive records. Medal citations. I want everything." "What's the urgency, sir?" "Family," he said, then added, "and honor." Lieutenant General Daniel Renier didn't pace often. He was a man trained in stillness, in calculating moves, and speaking only when words mattered. But now in the narrow hallway outside the National Security Office, he paced. His phone buzzed in his palm, seconds dragging like hours. He had just authorized something extraordinary, a fast-track executive review of an old Marine service record. Normally, such requests were buried under weeks of bureaucratic tape, but this wasn't normal. This was Frank Delaney, the man who once mailed Renier a hand-carved compass with a note, "Don't forget your direction, and don't lose your silence." Back then, Renier was just a boy. He didn't know Frank had served. He didn't know that compass was carved with one good hand. The other left damaged from war. But he knew now, and he couldn't let this go. Within minutes, the request reached the Department of Defense. Within 30, a joint team of archivists, intelligence analysts, and veteran affairs specialists were combing through what little survived of Frank's record. What they found was staggering. A handwritten report recovered from a backup microfiche file described a Marine sergeant who refused medevac during a siege in Da Nang so he could pull wounded men from a burning bunker. A blurred photograph, long classified, showed a man matching Frank's appearance using his own body to shield a mortar blast near a communications post. And then came the testimonies. 3 living Marines contacted through veteran networks, each gave nearly identical statements. "Frank Delaney saved my life, and he never asked for anything in return." One of them wept as he spoke over the phone. "I can still hear him reading from that little Bible of his, while everything around us was burning." At 3:18 p.m., a formal packet was assembled. It included a restored personnel record, an unsigned Silver Star recommendation from 1968, a handwritten letter from a now-deceased commanding officer stating, "If I had 10 men like Delaney, we would have walked out of that valley standing." The White House received it before sundown, and that's when the second call came, this time from the Chief of Staff's direct line. "Colonel Matthews," the voice said, "you're taking a team. Tonight, you're going to find Sergeant Frank Delaney, and you're going to make this right." Meanwhile, Frank sat alone at a small roadside diner near the edge of town. staring through a fogged window as the snow thickened. He hadn't driven home. The idea of another long stretch of road, of returning to a cold house with no working heater, felt heavier than usual. His fingers still hurt from gripping the steering wheel too long. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a kind voice, had refilled his coffee 3 times without charging him. She sensed something in him, something that didn't ask for help but needed it anyway. Frank's folder sat unopened beside him. It had taken him weeks to gather everything, decades to accept that he even needed to, and just minutes for it to be dismissed. He didn't know his story was burning through news feeds, that hashtags bearing his name had hit trending across the country, that congressmen were retweeting phrases like, "honor the forgotten," and "Frank Delaney deserves better." He didn't know there were 3 SUVs pulling into the icy parking lot outside. The bell over the diner door jingled. The room went quiet. People looked up. 3 uniformed officers entered, snow still clinging to their coats. The woman in front stepped forward, eyes scanning until they locked on him. "Sergeant Frank Delaney?" Frank turned slowly, his body aching, but his posture still upright. "Yes, ma'am," he said without hesitation. "I'm Colonel Rebecca Matthews. On behalf of the Department of Veterans Affairs and the White House Policy Office." She paused. "We're here to correct a mistake, sir." Behind her, a younger officer stepped forward and placed a leather-bound case on the table. Inside, a Navy cross. Frank looked at it, then back at her. "I never asked for this," he said. She smiled softly. "Exactly. That's why you deserve it." For a second, Frank Delaney thought he was dreaming. The snow outside still fell in silent sheets, muffling sound and blurring shapes. Yet there they stood, 3 uniformed officers in full-dress blues, their coats still dusted in white. The woman in front, Colonel Matthews, had eyes like his old gunnery sergeant, calm, precise, and unshakable. Frank looked down at the leather portfolio they had placed on the table. Inside were documents bearing presidential seals, a list of commendations, and something he never thought he'd see with his own eyes again: his service restored. Restored not just in name, but in truth. Colonel Matthews nodded gently to the officer beside her. He opened a polished wooden case with care, as if he were holding something sacred. Inside lay a medal, deep blue with a silver cross, glowing faintly in the dim light of the diner. The Navy Cross. Frank stared at it. His hands didn't move toward the box. Instead, they remained wrapped around his coffee mug, long gone cold. "I don't understand," he said softly, his voice gravel-worn but steady. "A full review was ordered after your story went public," Matthews explained. "Your records were confirmed, testimonies verified, and someone very high up made sure this didn't get buried again." "I didn't ask for this," he said again, not bitter, just bewildered. "No," she replied, her tone warm but firm, "but your country owed it to you, and to the men who lived because of you." Frank looked around. The room had gone utterly silent. Diners froze mid-bite. Forks hovered above plates. The waitress who had poured his coffee earlier now stood frozen, her eyes glassy with tears, still holding the coffee pot. From behind the glass windows, locals watched the scene unfold with quiet awe. Some had started filming. Others just stood still in the snowfall, unsure what they were witnessing, but certain it mattered. The younger officer who hadn't yet spoken cleared his throat, then stepped forward, back straight as a board. "Sir," he said, "it would be an honor to pin it for you." Frank hesitated, just long enough to feel the moment sinking in. Then slowly, wordlessly, he stood. The room reacted not with applause, but something deeper: respect. One by one, every uniformed person in the diner rose from their seats and snapped to attention. 3 Marines from a nearby table stood rigid, their expressions a mix of pride and shame. A retired Navy corpsman, seated in the corner and unnoticed until now, stood up and saluted, his hand trembling. Even the civilians began to rise. Some placed their hands over their hearts. Others simply bowed their heads. The officer gently fastened the Navy Cross to Frank's coat. It rested just above his heart, where the fabric was thin and patched from age. He didn't cry, but something behind his eyes shifted, like a dam long held in place had quietly cracked. When it was done, Colonel Matthews extended a formal salute. "For your service, your silence, "And your sacrifice, Sergeant Delaney." Frank returned the salute but said nothing. Words would have fallen short anyway. Then from outside came the sudden, unmistakable sound of engines. Dozens of them. A motorcycle club of veterans, alerted through social media, had arrived, forming a slow, silent procession around the diner. Their jackets bore patches from Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They weren't loud. They weren't revving. They were standing guard. As the news spread, more people arrived. Locals, fellow veterans, kids with handmade signs. One boy held up a poster that read, "He saved lives, let's honor one." Frank saw them through the window but didn't move. He just nodded once, more to himself than to anyone else. He turned to the colonel. "I only ever wanted one thing," he said quietly, "that the men I served with wouldn't be forgotten." "They're not," she replied, "and now, neither are you." The moment stretched, suspended in something more powerful than ceremony, something closer to redemption. As Frank sat back down, the metal now resting against his chest, the entire room exhaled. The waitress finally moved, walked over, and quietly refilled his cup. "No charge," she whispered. "That's the least I can do." Frank smiled, not wide but real, and for the first time in a long, long time, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Seen. By sunrise the next morning, the story had exploded. Clips from the diner. Frank Delaney standing with the Navy Cross on his chest, a room full of strangers rising to salute him, were everywhere. Major news networks scrambled to verify details. Cable anchors used words like reconciliation, justice, and long overdue. But it wasn't just a media frenzy. It was personal. Because in homes across America, people saw Frank and didn't just see a man. They saw their grandfather, their neighbor, their father who never talked about Vietnam, who still flinched at fireworks, who had once shown up to every Little League game without saying why it mattered so much. Suddenly, forgotten heroes were being remembered. Nursing homes reported that veterans who hadn't spoken about their service in decades were now being approached by family members asking questions. Really listening for the first time. Teenagers who had never opened a history book outside of school were Googling Khe Sanh, Da Nang, the Tet Offensive. And everywhere people were reposting a new phrase that had quietly become a kind of motto. Remember the quiet ones. At the Department of Veterans Affairs, things moved faster than anyone expected. The acting director, under pressure from both Congress and the public, announced a full-scale review of all veteran claims connected to the 1973 records fire. A new policy was drafted within days. Veterans with missing digital files could now submit verified testimonials and analog documents with the same legal weight as archived records. A task force was created to track down lost commendations. And at the heart of this reform, the Delaney Amendment. Named not by Frank's request, he would have been embarrassed, but because so many others demanded it. In the town where Frank lived, the diner that had served as the backdrop for that now iconic moment became an unofficial landmark. The owner placed a plaque on the wall where Frank had sat. It read, "Here sat Sergeant Frank Delaney, USMC, honored at last." Veterans from surrounding counties made pilgrimages to see it. Some left behind unit patches. Others left challenge coins. One man left a Purple Heart ribbon with a note, "For the one I never got to give you in '68. The high school Frank had once quietly supported, fixing chairs, welding broken handrails, helping kids build Pinewood Derby cars, held an assembly in his honor. Students unveiled a mural, hand-painted by the art class, depicting Frank not as a soldier in battle, but as an old man helping a teenager fix a bicycle. Above it were the words, "Service doesn't end with a uniform." Sakiburnun. But for all the national attention, Frank himself kept his life simple. He refused speaking engagements, turned down book deals, politely declined an invitation to meet the president, saying, "I already got more attention than I ever wanted. Let's focus on someone else now." When a fundraising campaign was launched in his name and raised over $180,000 in a week, Frank directed nearly all of it to a homeless veteran shelter in Richmond. "There are men sleeping under bridges who wore the same boots I did," he told organizers. "They need it more than I do." The only thing he allowed the government to do for him was fix the roof on his aging farmhouse. And even then, He insisted the crew install ramps for local veterans who used wheelchairs to come visit. And they did come. Men from units he had never served with, women who had enlisted decades later. Grandchildren of Marines who remembered the name Delaney whispered with reverence in war stories passed down through generations. They didn't come to thank him. They came to stand beside him. One day at a community event, a 10-year-old boy stepped up to a microphone with shaking hands. He looked out at the crowd, then over to Frank, sitting in his usual spot near the back. "I don't know what war is like," the boy said nervously, "but if I ever have to protect someone, I hope I can be like Mr. Delaney." Frank stood slowly, walked up to the boy, and extended his hand. No speeches, no lecture, just a firm, warm handshake. And in that moment, across age, experience, and history, something passed between them, a promise. That legacy isn't built in noise, medals, or fame. It's built in quiet strength, in integrity, in showing up again and again, even when no one's watching. After everything, the cameras, the headlines, the salute heard around the country, Frank Delaney did what he had always done. He went home. The snow had started to melt when he returned to the farm. The old gate creaked the same way it always had. The front porch sagged a little more. But the land was still his, still honest, still waiting for hands that knew how to make things last. There were letters waiting for him in the mailbox, some from strangers, others from men who had once shared a foxhole, now in their 80s with handwriting just as shaky as his. Frank read them all, quietly, without ceremony. He answered none, not out of disrespect, but because he didn't have much to say that hadn't already been said by silence. Within the week, he was back at it, fixing a broken wheelchair ramp for the widow 2 farms over, replacing fence posts with a boy from the high school who'd lost his father in Afghanistan, sharpening tools that hadn't been touched since fall. When a news station called asking for a sit-down interview, Frank politely declined. "The story ain't about me," he said. "It's about the boys who didn't make it home. Remember them." He didn't post online, didn't follow the trending tags. He never even watched the diner video that started it all, but he heard about it. The veterans who showed up on his porch just to shake his hand, the mural at the high school, the way people, strangers, started saying thank you again, and meaning it. Frank didn't need their words. He saw it in the way kids stood up straighter now, in how the local hardware store started offering free repairs for veterans, in the way his community started seeing the invisible. One crisp Saturday morning, as Frank sat whittling a broken axe handle back into shape, he heard footsteps in the gravel. He looked up. It was the boy from the diner, hair tousled, backpack slung over one shoulder, awkward hands shoved in his pockets. "Mr. Delaney?" the boy asked. Frank raised an eyebrow. Do you need help on the farm?" There was a pause, the kind of pause you only hear in places where the world slows down enough for the moment to mean something. Frank smiled, not a wide smile, but the kind that said everything. "You start," he said, "by showing up." The boy nodded, dropping his bag. Together they turned toward the shed. There were tools to organize, a fence to mend, a gate that wouldn't latch right, and a future to build. Not one made of monuments or medals, but of memory, of legacy, of quiet men who never asked to be seen, only to be remembered. In the end, Frank Delaney didn't want a parade. He wanted what every man who's ever worn a uniform truly hopes for: to be seen, to be remembered, and to know his service mattered, even when the world moved on. His story is a reminder that not all heroes make headlines. Some quietly fix gates, carry folded flags in their hearts, and walk through life with dignity the system may overlook, but a grateful people should never forget. In today's fast-moving world, where digital records decide truth and paper memories are dismissed, we must ask ourselves, how many other Frank Delaneys are still waiting, silently, just to be heard? And maybe more importantly, what will we do when we meet one? Will we stop, salute, or scroll past? This story isn't just about one man's redemption. It's about our responsibility to listen, to ask, to remember the ones who didn't come home, and those who did, carrying invisible wounds. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you known someone like Frank, a quiet veteran who never asked for thanks, but deserved it more than anyone? Let's honor them together by sharing their names and their legacies. Thank you for watching and for remembering. If you believe stories like this still matter, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Because the best way to say thank you is to never forget.